Good evening. My name is Michael Della Carpini. I'm the dean here at the Annenberg School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Annenberg and to the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communications 2017 Distinguished Lecture. The relatively recently formed center, known as CARG, is the marriage of two Annenberg initiatives: the Center for Global Communication Studies, founded and developed over 10 years ago by Professor Monroe Price, who almost single-handedly turned Annenberg into a truly global communication school, and we should acknowledge Monroe for that. Actually, we should acknowledge him more officially than that. And the Project for Advanced Research in Global Communication, founded by and led by Professor Marwan Crady 4 years ago. This merged entity and really redefined entity is designed to be an institute of advanced study that aims to produce world-class, field-defining research grounded in a vision of inclusive globalization that embraces bottom-up actors and the stunning diversity of global media, politics, and culture. It's also intended to be a meeting place for discussion of these topics. Now, that's obviously an ambitious goal, and I know of no one more capable of succeeding on reaching it than its current director, Marwan Crady. Marwan is the Anthony Shadid Chair in Global Media, Politics, and Culture here at the Annenberg School for Communication, where he's also affiliated with the Middle East Center, as well as several other centers here at Penn. An expert in global communication and a specialist in Arab media and politics, he also researches the relationship between culture and geopolitics, global media industries, theories of identity and modernity, and the political symbolism of the human body in the public sphere. He's also an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, one of several prestigious fellowships that he's received in just the last few years. Marwan has published over 10 books, over 120 essays and chapters, won 50 awards for teaching and scholarship, delivered keynote addresses and named lectures worldwide, and advised universities, civil society organizations, foundations, and governments. Notable books among the many that he's written include Hybridity, or the Cultural Logic of Globalization, Reality Television and Arab Politics, Contention in Public Life, and most recently, or at least one of the most recent books, is an account of the Arab Spring entitled The Naked Blogger of Cairo, Creative Insurgency in the Arab World, which came out with Harvard Press in 2016. He is also a frequent and insightful commentator on global media issues in various media platforms across the globe. I could say a lot more about Marwan, but we want to hear from our guest speaker, who Marwan will introduce. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Marwan Crady, who will introduce tonight's distinguished lecturer.
Thank you, Michael. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Saskia Sassen back to Annenberg. In a few moments, she will deliver the 2017 CARG Distinguished Lecture in Global Communication. But before I introduce her, I want to thank the Dean one more time. Michael has been a steadfast supporter since I've been at Annenberg, personally, but also of global communication research in general. I want to thank Marina Krikorian, who oversaw all logistics for this event, Corey, Deb Porter, Jamal, Etienne, Kyle, everybody who is here behind the cameras, behind the screens, behind the cables making this possible. I thank you very much. I also want to thank all my colleagues who are here in the room tonight. And I want to encourage you to tweet up a storm for the event. You have the program has all the details about that. I won't talk much about CARG since Michael introduced that, but I want to say a few words about Saskia. Saskia is the kind of scholar whose eminence makes it almost impossible to say just a few words. I will try, because we want to hear from her, as Michael said. Saskia Sassen is perhaps the foremost scholar of globalization writing today. She's the Robert S. Lynn Professor of Sociology and a member of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia. She is a student of cities, immigrations, states, networks in the world economy. She focuses on equality, technology, and digitization as three key variables that run through her work. She's the author of more than 9 books, I will speak mostly about 3 of them: Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, which came out with Harvard University Press in 2014. It's now out in 15 languages. Territory, Authority, and Rights, From Medieval to Global Assemblages, which came out of Princeton University Press in 2008, and is now also in multiple languages. My students in this semester's Theory and History in Global Communication read the entire book. Yes, and they survived it. I'm glad to report that they survived it. So Saskia is the recipient of multiple awards and distinctions, several doctor honoris causa. She's also been selected on many lists as one of the top global thinkers in the world today. Most recently, she was awarded the Príncipe de Asturias 2013 prize in the social sciences. That's from Spain. She's an elected foreign member of the Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences of the Netherlands, and she was made a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres by the French government. In her research, she has focused on the unexpected, on the surprising, on the counterintuitive, as a way to cut through established truth. Her 3 major books have each sought to demolish a key established truth. First, The Mobility of Labor and Capital, published by Cambridge in 1988, Saskia showed how foreign investment in less developed countries can actually raise the likelihood of immigration from these countries. That obviously went against the established common sense of the time. In her second book, or in a second book, The Global City, which came out with Princeton in 1991, she showed how the global economy, far from being placeless, like it was very current to say, has and needs very specific territorial insertions, and that this need is sharpest in the case of highly globalized and electronic sectors, such as global finance. Again, this went against established notion at the time that the global economy transcended territory. Third, in Territory, Authority, Rights, From Medieval to Global Assemblages, she shows that the foundational transformations afoot today take place largely inside core and thick national environment. This allows her to explain that certain changes in some liberal polities, including the United States, far from being exceptions, are actually results of these developments. She shows how this foundational transformation hence consists not only of globalizing dynamics, but also of denationalizing dynamics. She also points to 1980, and I have to say, in my circles, that's a bit controversial, as the beginning of globalization. Sassen is also a member of the Scientific Committee of the International Panel on Social Progress. A couple of weeks ago, CARG hosted the unveiling of the chapter on media and communication, of which I am a co-author. So Saskia is one of the sort of eminent scholars at the top of the pyramid of that project. In tonight's lecture, Digital Formations of the Powerful and the Powerless, Professor Sassen will explore how network technologies have the potential to open up established categories of formalized knowledge, and as a result, to unsettle their dominance. She will explain how elements from these practices can be remixed and serve the needs of a far broader spectrum of users and traditions, including those of the disadvantaged. Saskia, welcome to CARG. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, I sort of would have stayed there seated while you went on. You know, I was really enjoying that. So thank you for that very generous introduction. And it was a while since I last spoke here in this division of the university, but it's always a pleasure, I must say. So I'm very glad to be here. Here are some sort of basic data. Oops, where is my, here we go. So let me start. I just sort of throw myself in. I do want to thank everybody. I want to thank you. I want to thank Krikorian, Marina, who organized everything. I already told her she should consider running a little country. Then move on to a bigger one. We could really use her in this one too. So thank you very much. Nice seeing you again. So I want to start with a methodological moment, and that's all it is. And I must say, a bit at my age, you know, I've been at it for a century more or less. That's what it feels like. I have come to understand, maybe when we get older we do, that my zone is really a zone that I like to call before method. Now, before method is a very ambiguous terrain. You understand what I'm saying, right? But the way to understand this little proposition, so to speak, is that once you enter method, you are disciplined. You are disciplined to see certain things and not to see other things. And I, maybe because I was a bit transversal, you know, I have a doctorate in economics and sociology. I was unhappy with both. So, you know, I was and so this notion of putting myself, situating my inquiry in the fuzzy edges of paradigmatic knowledge rather than the hard center. I need that strong center, but that's not my favorite site, or that's not the site where most of my talents would reside. So I'm not throwing it out of the window. I want to see where it becomes fuzzy. And that, of course, means also communicating in a way or reaching out to fuzzy edges of other paradigms. And so I'm always a bit sort of, it's a mode of exploring. And so to give it an elegant title, this messy activity of mine, I say analytic tactics, which I think is beautiful. Don't you think so or not? Or tactical analytics. I'm still debating in my head. This stuff is really important to me, as you can tell. Is analytic tactics better than tactical analytics? I'm beginning to think that the second one is better. But anyhow, we can have a long discussion after this over wine and all kinds of other things. So anyhow, analytic tactics. Now, I should actually illustrate a bit. So what I mean by analytic tactics, just to give you a couple of examples, is that you can really position yourself vis-a-vis the object of study in whatever way you think should be considered. It may not be the definitive one, but a kind of freedom of action, freedom of choice of where it sides. And some of these analytic tactics, for instance, are, I usually have sort of a list of them here on the thing, and now I'm trying to remember what some of them are, I'll tell you. But basically it means unsettling a bit existing notions, especially notions that are strong. So rather than being at the center of knowledge, as I said, you go to the edges. I don't want to, I want to give perhaps one little example of what I mean by this. I have a whole list of these tactics. So one of them is, of course, dark street, center of light. The stronger that center of light, in other words, the stronger the paradigmatic moment, the more you can see everything in it, and the less you can see what falls outside of that center of light, the penumbra around it. So that is sort of an image maybe that helps to understand. And I find myself working a bit in the penumbra. Now, coming into the subject, I'm sort of throwing myself a bit here. These are some of the themes that I want to look at, partly via the examination of two issues. One of them is the capabilities of the financial sector to work under just about any conditions. That takes brilliant minds. We're far, far removed from microeconomics, as many of you know. We're talking really algorithmic mathematics. And just to give an example of what I mean for those who might not be so familiar with this all, as you know, student debt in this country is now worth over $1 trillion. I think it just read 1.3 trillion. Now, the traditional bank, which is about commerce, an institution we all need, by the way. Commerce is fine, in my book at least. The traditional bank wouldn't know what to do with it. Finance, $1.3 trillion. Debt, doesn't matter. It's $1.3 trillion in some version or another. It can work with that. So that already gives you an idea of a difference between the traditional bank, the commercial bank, and this new type of high finance that begins to develop in the 1980s when we deregulate, privatize, et cetera, when it gets a chance to really invade sectors that before it could not handle. So the magic, if you want, of finance is that it can work just with about anything. And I will show some of those examples. One of them is what I just mentioned, student debt. Once it reaches over $1 trillion, we can do something with it. That's quite amazing. That takes, in some ways, extraordinarily complex forms of knowledge. Like some of these instruments that I'm dealing with are 6 extraordinary steps in order to actually generate something that you wonder about. There's a real asymmetry there. Now, so here are some of these things that I really want to get into sooner or later in this presentation. And one of them is, can the city hack? And by hack, I mean the original meaning. I mean what we meant, which is unsettle the original meaning. So it's not hacking in a negative thing. It's not about robbery. It's about the capacity to unsettle an original design or a first version design, whatever. Open sourcing the neighborhood. By this, what I'm getting at, and this is a project that I care a lot about, is in a city like New York, just to take that example, because that's where I'm doing my field work, a lot of the low-income neighborhoods have barely any effective tech, this just not. They're all invited to consume, to buy. In other words, buy existing products which you consume, music, whatever it might be. The point is, so one question that I have, and it led me to this, is for whom are innovations developed? And it really, I mean, of course, the scientists, us, professionals, etc. But for low-wage workers, there is very little that meets their needs. So I got very interested in understanding what are the little. So one, for example, and a lot of this is experimental. This is not about money making. This is brilliant students, who develop these. So one of these is called, we call the emergency nanny. So here's the setting. Just to give you an idea of this, we're talking totally different world from these very fancy innovations. Low-income neighborhood, workers who work in low-wage workplaces. The worker, she, the worker, has a crisis in the back home. She cannot just pull out her little phone and begin to make calls. See, who can go home because my aunt didn't come who was meant to take care of the grandma or the children? That kind of a situation. They will not allow her on these workplaces in New York City. Maybe they allow in Philadelphia, I don't know. But we're talking really crappy, I'm sorry for the term, workplaces. But what she can do is click very discreetly on an app, the emergency nanny. The emergency nanny is a group of people that are in the neighborhood that are static. The hairdresser, the small shopkeeper, the butcher. You may not want the butcher to go home, take care of your kids, but so people are there who may not love each other, who may not, but you, the worker back there, has selected these people that if I have a crisis, I call on you. And then one of them goes and takes care of things. So we're talking very elementary, little thingies that can make a difference. In my reading, these types of apps also begin to make tissue. My experience, at least in New York City, in many low-income neighborhoods, people do not love their neighbors. People are so stressed out. They are so blah, blah. So how do you make tissue, a tissue that can work? And very interesting is that, for instance, in Latino neighborhoods, there is much more of an inclination to get to know the others, to organize, than in some other. It varies a bit. But basically, very low-income neighborhoods in a city like New York, they are deprived of a lot of options, of a lot of opportunities. So one notion for me in this open sourcing the neighborhood is what are the set of first little steps that can begin to build a sort of platform. And when I say platform, another issue that is extremely important in this research that I'm doing, which looks at how the legal system handles workplace accidents that have to do with, with electronic machines or whatever it might be. It takes very special lawyering to handle that. Most judges and most lawyers are not trained for that. So if you're a high-income worker and there is an issue on the workplace that involves a machine or whatever, and something that is electronic, you can have access to very fancy lawyers. Your firm will enable you. If you're a low-wage worker, The workers are the ones who get. The data is quite strong on that. The worker always is guilty when it's a low-wage workplace, and when it's a high, then you can get out of it in one way or another. So there is a slowly accumulating set of little injustices. But we know how that from other histories of the poor and the disadvantaged, where that can end. That can end in truly spaces of misery, very problematic incarcerations, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at the legal scholarship, I don't know if there are any lawyers here, I mean, this is a whole new world in many ways to deal with. So anyhow, I already talked about the third one. Now, first, I want to just sort of revisit this notion of what are we really talking about, and especially given that we are researchers, the notion of digitization as a variable. In other words, something that can take on many different, it's not on a one-to-one, it's many, many, many different instantiations of it. So it can be, and secondly, it can be derivative. It might as well be a fancy whatever. It might be transformative, or it might be constitutive. And for me, frankly, the third one is one that really interests me, where it actually constitutes new worlds, new settings, new spaces, new notions of what can be done. I already touched a little bit on some of that until now. The second issue that I think is important, and it's not always so easy to do, and we still have work to do on this, is how do we factor in social logics into these systems? We call it tech. We tend to think of it as tech. But insofar as they are interactive with work situations, with people's lives, with whatever, there is another vector in there. And so how do we detect that kind of vector? And so here are sort of very quickly, some things I've written at length about this, imbrications between IT and social contexts, the mediating cultures. I remember way back when that I, being a foreigner, I was spending some time on the East Coast in Stamford, and I was just amazed at how the notion of the screen, remember that, the screen, that was sort of the mediation. That's not a mediation. Mediation is a whole other set of processes. I wanted to recover this notion of what mediates between us and the machine. And it is not the screen. The screen it's just, and so it could be all kinds of things. When we begin to think that in order to fully enter the meaning and the capacities of these technologies, there is an in-between space that remains a bit unmarked. Every now and then, in certain kinds of analyses or makings, it appears. And so I would say that I'm trying to get at that a bit also in thinking about these technologies vis-a-vis low-income neighborhoods, where the mediations are going to be different. So that's sort of such an extreme condition that, it helps you seeing. The question of scaling, we don't need to go into that. And then very, very quickly, and this is also what I want to talk about, how these technologies have worked for the powerful and how they have worked for the powerless. And while we have many immigrant groups, for instance, who have been very good at creating global networks that serve their needs, like the Filipino women, partly because they all are somehow engaged also with the Catholic Church. And Catholic churches are everywhere, so they have managed to actually create a global network where they alert each other. They say, don't go with those traders, or not traders, what do we call them? The ones that take, immigrants over borders and all of that. Now, and finally, the particularity of low-income situations, of the poor, of those who do not easily have the standing to make a claim. You should, like, if you're a scientist and you tell some, whatever, we need this kind of tech, I mean, you'll get it, if it can be done. The poor, they don't have standing. They cannot say, we need this tech. They just don't have that. There is no moment in their lives where they can say and make this claim. We as academics, we can make claim. We may not get what we ask, but we can make the claim. And so this notion that we have growing numbers of people in cities that are totally connected with the world who have no standing to make a claim. And you say, you know what my neighborhood needs? They need that. City government or whatever, can you please provide that? I mean, this just doesn't happen. And so I'm also sort of pushing for that notion that if we look at the city as a complex system, now we're saying complex but incomplete. Huh? To me, that is a critical juxtaposition to get at the notion of the city. We need to include that, you know, the possibility, giving standing, you know what I mean by standing, huh? That you can make a claim to those who now, I mean, they clean out this, they take care of our kids, they work in hospitals, zero standing. What they get to do is they get to buy the mass consumption thing, you know, the music and all of that. The scientists, we the professionals, my students, they can all make claims about we need this. Can you figure out, you know, I don't mean who the person is to whom they make or the entity, but you know what I'm talking about, right? And they'll get it. And then we have a world. And I must say, New York City is far worse than Mumbai. Yeah, they live in slums, but by God, have they worked on the tech. We have communities in New York City where to get online, they use dial-up. That is expensive, that is slow like hell. I mean, what is this? This is worse than in so many, you know, there are poor in Tokyo, where I just came from, but you know what? They have access to, so this is so extreme. In a city like New York, I don't know what it is like. Philadelphia looks far more civilized, huh? But now, are we here? Right, I did that. So the other issue that I have always been really interested in is the mediating cultures. So that was another irritant way back when, that, you know, this notion that the screen was, no. There are so many different, and I love to tell these cases. An anthropologist who was in a team that I was sort of working with went to the Middle East, I think it was Lebanon, I'm not totally sure, but tried to compare sort of people who were really young people with money, who were totally, you know, with it, with the scholars of the Quran, because there was a growing number, it was still small, of scholars of the Quran who were going online. And the notion was that the modern youth was, of course, the more at home with the technology, and that those fancy, and that the scholars of the Quran were not. Well, it was just the opposite, for one simple reason. The fancy youth just navigated existing networks to shop, to find out. The scholars of the Quran, if they were going to use the technology, had to develop their platforms, because they are small groups, you know, that then communicate with others. They had to set up, they had to install, so to say, elements to produce the possibility of them using it. So I think this is important to know, you know, that what looks like it is the more traditional, the more or less with it can act. And that is then brings me back also to low-income workers. Some of those low-income families and workers know exactly what they need, and it would really make a difference. Many of my brilliant students, they're just in la-la land compared to understanding, what do I really need here, you know? So I don't want to put down my students. I love my students, okay? But you know what I'm talking about. It's just well, I don't need to develop too much here. Now, the other thing that I have found extremely interesting in all of this is the fact that when you have organizational complexity, you can actually extract, it makes a lot of sense, by the way, extract many more benefits from this technology than if it's a simple operation. You know, I mean, this is self-evident in many ways, but we often forget it. And so I just wanted to put that. So finance is very good at this. Huh? And some other sectors, not. They just, you know, they're sort of like passive consumption, that kind of a version. This notion of social digital for me, what I'm really talking about is bringing into the tech zone variables that are not part of the tech in order to get, this is my particular interest because I'm not a techie, right? I'm not developing new, though I'm now working with people whom I'm asking to develop certain types of techs, you know, for these low-wage neighborhoods, et cetera, but that's another story. Now here, you can just read this very quickly. Just a final point. Within a given space and time, technologies are distinctive conditions or capabilities. Even in the long run of history, they become part of, more complex settings. I hope that I'm not losing you with this last sentence. You know what I mean? I mean, you can figure it out. Now, here are two cases where these technologies have truly been transformative. They are not just a cherry on top of the ice cream. There's many of the ways in which you use the tech, it's nice, it's a nice addition. But where they are really, and one thing is the global financial organization that I will develop a bit, and the other one is something that is a potential more than a reality, that in some countries it is also a reality, which is really people who are at the edges of a society, who have very low incomes. Boy, could some of those, say, apps make a difference. Whereas for so many people, I mean, as long as you have your music, you have your this, you have your that, you're fine. No, for the poor, it could make all the difference. I have repeated that now enough times that I'm hoping. Now, coming back to cities, there are these larger ecologies, of meaning of these technologies, right? I've just described to these two extremes, those who are the well-off and the poor, etc. And in cities, of course, this can become extreme, what I just described. So the specific technical capabilities of interactive technologies deliver. This to me is a very important point that, it's more the social scientist in me and the techie, but technologies that deliver their utilities through complex ecologies. It's not just a technical element. It is also the milieu, etc., where they also include the logics of users. So this is sort of summarizing what I just described in some detail, right? So there are all these different ways. These are all different, if you want, channels into the technological question, right? It's not just the tech on its own terms. It's also the tech in some interaction with something else. They also include the logics of users, and these can diverge significantly. This, for me, is a very important point. Clearly, I have already elaborated that, what the poor need, etc. And these can diverge significantly from the engineer's logic. The engineer has her own project, right? How can we make this even better and more complex and reach that? Some of these poor people, they just need something very simple. In the city, this means, if you want to make it all work, I would argue that it means maximizing what I like to think of as a sort of open source urbanism. Open source urbanism is just one set of elements. It's not the whole city, clearly. It's not everything in a city. But it's a particular set of vectors that are making a lot of difference for some actors and could make a lot of difference for actors which are not necessarily, certainly in a city like New York, let me just be very careful here, it's not really quite happening. Now, here I now want to go very concrete. It starts with buildings. It starts with what some of you must have seen, buildings in New York City, in Manhattan, which you see there, standing rather underused. Do you know what I'm talking about or not? Do you have a visual on it, as they say? Isn't that a very American phrase that I just, with my foreign accent? Do you know what I'm talking about or not? So you have a set in Manhattan of rather elegant, brilliant towers, new towers that have been built in the last 10 years or so. And many of them are quite empty. And there's a lot of dinner talk also about it. And it looks like the investors made a mistake. I've been at dinner tables with very smart people. They say, you see, they made a mistake. Hell no, if only. Those buildings, those empty towers, have two functions. One is you store your capital, right? I mean, it's very elementary there. But the other one is a really dangerous one. It's dangerous for cities. It's dangerous in many ways. And that is that the buildings are financialized. And what that means, strictly speaking, is that they have, their site in urban space where you see them in their emptiness. And then they function in not just the commodity circuit, but asset-backed securities. They are a source, a big source, to pull out something that you can call an asset and generate an asset-backed security, which the high investment circuit now wants. They're done with derivatives. They said, enough of derivative. Give me an asset-backed security. And so those buildings are delivering more profit than they would if they were rented out. Do you know what that means for cities? You understand how bad that is, right? Mm-hmm. So we could wind up with a whole, first they displace little shops, they displace, more modest housing for professors and policemen and I don't know what all. And then they stand empty, dark, really a desolate experience in lower Manhattan and in mid-Manhattan more. So this is serious stuff, and I want to elaborate a bit on this. So I'm looking at the top 100 cities, especially the top 50, because the second 50, they keep changing, but which are the objects of desire, if you want, of investors. National, international, doesn't matter, really. Really, whether who's doing it, whether it's a local or a foreigner, somebody from Kazakhstan, it absolutely doesn't make a difference, given what the aim ultimately is. So now this is just buying of existing property. So this is a first little modest step in a process that has, and this happens to be this 1 year. Now I just got the data for 2014 from 2015 to 2016, and it just has grown more. So this is just buying of existing property, no new buildings. This is this 1 year, so 55 billion for New York Metro, London Metro, blah, blah. At the end there, oh, right, I have it. Here, is this working? So this is just, this compares to the prior year. The fact that it says minus 29 doesn't mean that it necessarily went down. It's just less than. It doesn't mean that that's a total negative in the, it just means that it is less than was the year before. And yeah, and so just buying 1 year properties, et cetera, et cetera. Then this is just foreign, all right? Now, there London is the queen, huh? But you can see also the Amsterdam, I don't know what they're buying there, it's not that big. Look at that, 248%. Who knows? And if you look at the top 50, you just see, what the hell? You just look at the data and you know that there is some research to be done here as to what are the logics, what are the motives, etc. And now the other thing that I find absolutely just, so in London and in New York, people are very aware. In Paris, they're not. And even the Germans are buying up big parts of Paris. You would think that that would do it, that the French, they're Germans rather than the Kazakhstanis? No. I wrote a first article there in La Tribune, a big newspaper, and people wrote to me and said, what? It was like a discovery. Whereas, in New York, I don't know about Philadelphia. Do you know how that is going on here? You haven't reached that point, right? That's one way of putting it. Anyhow, and yeah. So, oops. Let me just move on here. So here are just a few, I just wanted to clarify. Loss, when it describes, is a fall in investment compared to the prior year. It does not mean that there wasn't investment. You understand what I'm saying, right? And so here are like some of the figures. And see, for instance, these changes like Shanghai and Beijing. Beijing is on a negative now, but Nanjing has just entered the picture. So that is 142% increase over the prior year. Now, if you look, for instance, at Germany, where you have 5 major cities in play, the one that Berlin has the most in total, like 12 billion, I can't remember the exact number now, but the one that is growing most rapidly is Hamburg. Why? Because they've already done Berlin and Frankfurt and München. Time for, so in other words, it's a roving little animal. You understand what I'm saying? And so, and eventually I think I'm getting there, what that means. What does it mean that we've done Berlin? We've done blah, blah. So here you have, for instance, here is what I was going to get. So look at Berlin. It has 11 million. Huh? Hamburg, 5. But its growth rate compared to the past year is higher than Berlin, where it's negative. So you can see, okay, we've done Berlin, right? So it is moving and grabbing. Now, so here this is just a little aside to indulge my own engagement with the material. And so one of the, it's a little proposition, a little one, that I'm working on is, did the material at some point in the past give us sort of a good account? Could we trust its speech? Because today, it doesn't quite. So so this is a set of buildings, most of which, except for this very ugly one, I think. I hope there are no architects who do this type of architecture in the room. I apologize, I don't mean to offend. So these are some very nice buildings. This is the center of London. This is the river there. I had to walk with a journalist who said, come walk with me through all that stuff that you're writing about. I really never go there. You know, I don't need to go there. And so there I was, and I heard the tourists, they were just, it's full of tourists there. And they were saying, some of them, you know, were saying, look at all these nice British buildings. I immediately went and did research, the area, and I found that this bunch are all owned by one Chinese company. And so, and nothing against the Chinese, by the way. Huh? The Chinese are the main buyers. Huh? So I keep mentioning the Chinese. Now, what strikes me here is that the material is not telling you something, right? We tend to think that if it's material, there it is, you know, and it's truth, maybe not full truth. And here, you know, you can be completely. Now, I think here I have, just as a way of explaining why I focused. Right, the Chinese right now are the main investors in the world. This is a footnote to explain why I wind up, because I might come back to more Chinese cases, but I can't remember if that's the case here. Their bank, their development bank, is now bigger than the World Bank, you know, our Western World Bank. So the reason one winds up very often talking about the Chinese in this case is not because they are the baddies, it's because they are investing everywhere. And you know the big new project that involves 65 countries. I don't know if people know about it. This is a very strange title, very Chinese sort of notion of how to name a huge project. Now, the 100 cities that I'm looking at by property investment account for 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP. That's quite formidable. This is a very deviant fact. 76% of property investment. What it really means is 76% of all the properties that have been financialized. So this is, you know, in other words, most properties in the world have not been financialized. I just need to clarify that. So I find this language is not quite, but this is quite significant, you understand? Now, if you, the source is Savills. I would say that Savills knows what they do. They are a very big firm, they have a lot of researchers, very, very smart people. According to them, this is a different figure. According to them, worldwide real estate assets, again, these are financialized as buildings. These are not just all fancy buildings. They're buildings that have been roped into a financialized circuit, okay? So assets are nearly 60% of the value of all global assets, including equities, bonds, and gold. What is not mentioned there is derivatives, you know, asset-backed securities, etc. Equities, bonds, and gold are pretty traditional investments. Now, 217 trillion, as you know, is more than global GDP. So, wow, that figure can only be reached, same thing with the figure that I showed before, because those buildings are operating in two circuits. One is the building, and the other one is the financialized circuit, where they can be bought or parts of the building, the whole building, whatever, mostly it's part of the building. So that other world, to achieve what it does, needs an extraordinary type of instruments and, modus operandi, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's really brilliant stuff. As I said already, and many of you know, this has nothing to do with economics, microeconomics or macroeconomics. This is algorithmic math. I love to mention the fact that nowadays, if you walk into any of the, if you're allowed to come in, any of the big financial firms. I mentioned Goldman Sachs because I have a friend there and he has allowed me to see a lot of stuff. And what you see in the back room in quotation marks, which was the space where the secretaries used to sit, now it's 100 physicists. I'm not blaming the physicists, but we're talking, I had a chance to really get at the innards of the instrument that was developed that produced the how did we call it when all those houses went kaput? You know what I mean? Yeah, well, it was not the bubble. It was the kind of, and so that is an instrument that has 6 very complex steps that made it possible to, on the one hand, deal with what were basically 16 million very modest households on which no money had been put, basically, I mean, with some exceptions. And that generated a lot of profit for those who didn't hang on to that, and of course then created the crises, and all of those who hung on to the properties or to the instruments had a crisis. Huh? This is a bit complicated, so let me not, but we can return to it if you really want to know more details. We can do the discussion. The point here is that these valuations don't exist at this level, they exist at that other level. The concern when it comes to cities, as I said already, is that we can wind up with a lot of very beautiful, empty, dark at night buildings that hollow out the notion of urbanity. And that's great for the business. It's not great for urbanity, for the cities. You know what I'm saying, right? I mean, this is absolutely sort of, it's an extreme innovation, is what we could say. That's not the concept of the city. Now this, for instance, this is 65,000 buildings in the greater London area, and not, I'm not talking way outside. These are all owned by offshore companies. They're all shell companies. We don't know who owns it. And again, the way, when you go check it out, they don't seem to be very used. So this has, I don't know. For me, again, I wound up coming up with this term of the de-urbanizing of cities via these very tall towers that we think of, my God, that is urban. Huh? Now, we in New York have this kind of, some of you must have seen this, these buildings are very fancy, Time Warner, etc., fantastic, and they're increasingly, the few who live there are leaving it because they say, I'm totally alone here, So, and here is another one. They're all owned by Shell companies, not all, but 57%, etc., very high. Now, what is happening with this kind of stuff is, of course, the same thing that I just described. They may well be delivering a lot of money via the financializing of those buildings rather than renting out or selling the units. That is actually, when you think about it, it's a terrifying notion for what it does to urbanity, to the notion of the urban. Now, here is something, as you read, are we dealing with a new systemics that is not total, not totalizing, not everywhere, but that is installing itself in some of these, if you want, we could call them economic sectors or economic opportunities or investment modes, whatever language works. And just as a juxtaposition, this is a graph, as you can see. Let's see, do I have a pointer here? So this is corporate profits after tax in the US, 1940s to 2010s. So this is, the crises in 2008, etc. So here you see blah, 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 and then you see, okay, sharp rise. That begins in this epoch when you have a lot of innovations. This is corporates. So this is US corporates. And then a very sharp fall, the crises, that must have lasted about 2 minutes, when you look at this. And then poof, after that, better than before. Now, when you look at the new jobs that were created after the crises, you know what I'm talking about, right? The 2008 crises, about 80% were low-wage jobs. They were not. Whereas the jobs that were killed, about half of them were sort of good, strong, middle-class jobs. So there was a real, what came up, the jobs that we recovered after the 2008 crises were far more low-income jobs and fewer sort of mid-level jobs, which is what a city wants. And if you look at corporate assets, what are we talking about, the crises? It lasted even less, right? This is extraordinary, actually, when you think of all the losses that have happened also. Now, in major cities, we have one way of putting it all is that we have expulsions dressed in the clothing of upgrading and modernization. New York City really looks much prettier in many ways than it did in 1976 when it was broke. 10 minutes, oh my God. He just told me that I have 10 minutes. He was trying to do that very silently. So a massive loss of habitat for very modest households in the global model. Now, the digital part, I just want to clarify, is all the mode of financializing and how that. So now, this I'm not going to get to, but there is a lot of blah, blah. You read it very quickly. At its most extreme, we see two, and I repeat, at its most extreme, we see two rising urban formats. Now, that doesn't quite work for Europe. It doesn't quite work for the United States, probably, at least until now, but it works for many other parts of the world. And these are it. La periferia, as we say in Latin America, which is a lot of housing. Some of it is fine, some of it is not, some of it is regular, but this is vastly expanding. We see that because all the land grabs in the rural areas are producing massive expulsions of people. The only place where they can go is the city, because the city is never a fully controlled space. And then in the back up there, you have the high-rise buildings. And if there is no land, they're building it on water. So this gives you a sense of a loss of land also, which is part of the story that we're living through, which is the big mining corporations, the new types of minings, the Nestle's and Coca-Cola's who are buying land all over just to extract the water. In our country, they do it for free, basically. I don't know if you know the data, right? Nestle and Coca-Cola are grabbing vast amounts of water, and they barely have to pay. They pay like $20, per, I don't know, it's nothing. But the land grab question has really intensified a certain kind of urbanizing, and this is part of that. We are running out of land. Oh, so this one, there is no place in the world where you can stand and see this. Both are real. So this is in Mexico, a area in Mexico, and the one above, I can't remember where that is, but it is an Asian city. It's one of these Asian cities where they just keep building. I think it's in China. But an artist put these two together, and I usually mention that, by the way, that, because I always get asked, where do I have to go to see this?
I mean, it looks like a representation.
Exactly, you can actually see it, right? Whereas this one is an image, of a. Okay, I'm not going to skip this. Now, I want to end then very rapidly and brutally with this notion, why does all of this matter? When all is said and done, these alterations that I described in urban space. And I think that one issue for me is that the city today is one of the spaces where the big city, not the tiny little cute town where everything is controlled, you know, but the city is a space where those without power actually can get to make a history, you know, a local economy, a culture. Think of all the immigrant communities. And I would say that some of these current conditions really do become a threat to that. You know, we're going to be losing some of these types of urban residents who make their own, you know, local economies and have their own cultures that, in my reading, by the way, this is a big footnote now, but don't worry, it will only take me a minute, okay? So, see, I have asked myself the question, are there any truly sort of international, you know, sort of worldly cities that do not have immigrants? There aren't. I really think, so then I developed a little project that was, I argue that the thickness of many of the cultures that immigrants bring, in other words, we're not talking middle class with already cleansed, whatever, you know, and sort of, no, thick cultures. They bring that, how to make food in a certain way, how to, whatever, you know, that eventually they travel. And so the first step out of the ghetto, so to say, is ethnic food, right? Ethnic clothing. And we sort of stop at that. So I argue that it actually keeps on traveling and eventually becomes constitutive, along with other elements already there, of the cosmopolitanism that we so much admire in big cities, right? And at that point, we have lost the fact that they started in thick cultures. If you don't have thick cultures, how are you going to get sort of a mix of strong elements, you know, however rarefied they have become? And so to me, I really try to understand, are there any really sophisticated cities, yeah, as we call them, etc., very that lack immigrants? And frankly, I haven't been able to. Now, it's not like I have checked out all the cities in the world, that could be. But, so I'm always interested in hearing the whatever. You know? So, back to this, and current conditions are a threat to this enablement of the poorer classes. So part of the story for me is, one way of framing it is, where is the frontier in today's world? The frontier, the historic frontier, being a space where actors from different worlds have an encounter for which there are no established rules of engagement, right? And so a process has to happen. Well, in the past, we slaughtered them. We conquered them. We enslaved them, etc. Today, given what I've been doing on land grabs and all of that, and mining in the rural areas also, the frontier is no longer out there. It's not. I can think that the only place where we have a kind of frontier, in that sense of actors from different worlds having an encounter for which there are no established rules of engagement. There is not a simple hierarchy that says, okay, no, it doesn't. It's actually in our big cities, big messy cities. I doubt that Philadelphia could have that. It's too neat. But maybe I don't know Philadelphia well enough, right? But you know, and in the space of the city, those without power can actually stand and talk to power and say, and here I invoke this Latin American, I grew up in Argentina, etc. Power, poder, estamos presentes. We're present. We're here. We're not asking you for anything. We'll make our economy. We'll make our culture. We'll make our food, whatever, right? And it takes a big, messy city to enable that. But that, I think, becomes critical, because those without power are really getting expelled in very large numbers. And if our big, not fully controllable cities still can contain that, that matters. And hence, I'm doubly upset about those developments that I've shown you, for instance, for the case of New York City. I think I'm on my, and then the final point. Another thing that intrigues me a lot is the notion of an urban subject. Most of the time, no matter how urbane or whatever we are, we're not urban subjects. We are mother, father, a religion, a job, an oppression, whatever. We're not. And so, but there are moments in the daily routines in a city where we do all become urban subjects. Like when we're all running to catch the subway, evening, you know, the mixity of worlds. And it's fine, it's how it should be. You know, people say, oh, what are you doing here? No. You know, so you have an executive, certainly in the subway in New York, an executive next to a cleaning woman. That's good. You know, that I'm not saying that that makes for a better city, but that's a moment when we are all urban subjects. It's especially good for the executive. You understand what I'm saying, right? To have that experience. And that is something that is under threat today. And with this very happy note, thank you. I'm done. Do we do questions or is it time to drink?
Some people have to leave,
Okay.
and then we'll start questions afterwards.
Very good. Very good. Shall we?
Okay, time for questions. Please address your questions directly.
Yes.
So, first of all, thank you. Really thought-provoking. And I'm trying to decide or figure out what work, the part of your story that involves not so much just the financial investment, the out-of-country financial investment in urban areas, but the fact that the investment takes place and what you call hollow vanity results does for your story. So I could imagine that the challenge to the urban poor that you described being true, even if these investments were taking place in the places were being lived in or not.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's a separate piece of what you're describing that makes it different or worse or because of the hollowing out. And could you talk just a little bit more about what you think that piece does to the story you're trying to tell?
Okay, well, two levels, you know, to the issue. One is that the search for housing becomes even complex for middle-class people, you know, etc., because you just are occupying urban space, you're eliminating prior housing. So, you know, it gets to be really a negative weight. And thereby impoverishes people a bit because you have to put too much money into that, etc. But for me, the other thing, the critical thing, is that we need that frontier space. We need for the cities to be actually fully alive, and for the center of the city, it matters that there be jobs there rather than empty buildings, because that is also an encounter between, you know, between rich and poor. I mean, I think there is a kind of this issue of an urban subject that gets diminished, is less present. I mean, those are some of the issues. But probably there are other things that one could, you know, add to the list. Did I answer your question or? Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I do think that this urban subject moment, when we are all urban subjects, you know, running to catch the train at night or whatever, it matters. You know, there's a whole accumulation of these elements, and I'm very interested in understanding at what point, also in the daily routines of the city.
I mean, I agree with that, but I find myself not knowing the answer, but wondering whether that is kind of a nod back to cosmopolitan, whether that's true for us in this room as opposed to the larger pop. Is that as important to the urban poor as it is to us? I guess is what
No, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. But I think in the long run, this I'm sort of one way of putting it is this de-urbanizing of the central area does, we don't know exactly, but it does create a shadow effect. And for me, what is also interesting is that cities, I don't know if I mentioned that here, cities have outlived, big, good, complex cities, and not all cities, certainly not all towns, have outlived many systems with far more power and standing. And you know what? The neighborhoods, the poor neighborhoods, though with new inhabitants, and sort of other parts of the city, they have sort of been able to cut across many different histories in ways that very powerful closed systems have not. So for me, this also becomes one way of understanding this difference between open and closed system. And the way they have it is by continuously being able to destroy and to incorporate, right? And now we're building rigidities in a way that are problematic in that sense. Yes?
Hi, thank you. It occurs to me, I think of the Time Warner Center when I think of these sorts of buildings. And while I think you're right that it's pretty empty, around there, if you walk around in the streets, it's totally filled. Because what happens is people live like gerbils in smaller apartments.
Yeah,
and they're forced out to the street. So I think what Michael was saying about the idea that it affects the central core but raises the prices. And if you have enough wealth surrounding it, people find jobs and they live very differently than they would live, say, in Philadelphia because of this kind of internationalization. But I wanted to bring up another topic which relates to this, and you didn't bring it up, and that's Airbnb.
Oh, right.
And I think that on a lower level, but just as problematical from certain points of view, you have the monetization of neighborhoods through Airbnb, even rentals. I was in a rental over the weekend, I have to say, that was an Airbnb rental. Someone who was renting actually 3 apartments in a middle-class area of Boston, which is becoming much more expensive.
Yeah.
He was renting the apartments to other people paying his rent.
Yeah.
So this is becoming maybe a similar kind of dynamic.
No, absolutely, this is happening very strongly. And now we have corporations who are building what looks like little apartments, but they're literally just fully 100% dedicated. It's not your home, that you're sort of subletting for a bit. That was the original concept, right? You know what I'm saying? And now it's made to purpose. Now, say the mayor of Barcelona, La Clau, she's an activist, etc., who became mayor, surprise us all. She has said, no more R&Bs, no more franchises, because the franchises are destroying the local economies, People, the tourists come and they just want their familiar product, only they want to buy it in Barcelona. And so, and she has taken a very strong position, because Barcelona, is a small city that has 30 million tourists a year. And they come there, and they just want the familiar brand. So they are destroying the local. They want the familiar brand also for the cafes and right? I mean, it's a kind of, do you understand what I'm saying? Am I speaking in too much shorthand, or do you get what I'm saying, right? Yeah. And so it's destroying all the local business. It's destroying a lot of stuff, And R&Bs hang in there a bit, especially when they become to be 100% dedicated R&Bs. In other words, nobody lives there. It's not that you're renting out your house for a week or two. No, it's a business. And she has, put down because cities are really suffering under this. This is just part of the story that you also alluded to. You're looking to me as saying, what am I talking about? Yes.
This is a dynamic, A, that lots of people have discussed, and B, that seems to be unstoppable, both of those activities. You can make laws against Airbnb, but people are going to do it anyway. It's really hard to stop.
Well, you can stop the corporations from doing that, building for that purpose R&B building, so to say. But anyhow, you're right. Very difficult to stop these mechanisms in a city, that is not a small town. Yes.
I just wanted to ask why this is all happening. I mean, the systemic processes you talked about were digitization, financialization, and mediation. But surely that isn't enough of a structural explanation of what is behind this. And I was struck that there wasn't a mention of, for example, neoliberalism as one way of thinking about a new version of capitalism which redistributes. So what is the bigger picture? Why this is taking place?
Absolutely. And I often like to talk about that, but I don't know why I didn't do it. But anyhow, So in my reading, there is sort of a global era that starts when we deregulate, privatize, and sort of globalize, right? And this made, I have a whole book on this, this made an extraordinary difference in so many sectors. So we wind up, for instance, just to give you a couple of examples to say how I look at it. So for many years, for about 8 years, the biggest, how do we call it? Not slum, homeless encampment in the United States. Do you know where it was? In Silicon Valley. So the 2008 crisis, all these people that were all rising, etc., they lost houses, and I went there. I have images of it. And when you are standing on top of the hill, it was at the bottom, you didn't see it. But when you started from the bottom, you saw it. And so 2 features. So they were mostly young men, mostly men, and they had great bikes and great sneakers. Okay? So they had decided to keep that, but they were living with cloth hanging over it. And so they were just destroyed. I mean, this is also part of this story, right? So I just want to emphasize that when the crisis comes, there were a lot of people who lost. We have now scaled up elements of this modality to a way that, even more people could be wiped out. We have, as you know, the data shows that, I alluded to one element of it, that the middle class is now 2 classes. There's no middle class. There are 30% of people who are richer than they ever thought they would be in a city like New York, and then another 30% who are much poorer than they thought, and their children are not making as well. These are all familiar stories. So we have gone through an extraordinary change. And for me, as I said, one starting point, I've really spent quite a bit of time trying to understand it, is deregulation, privatization, and globalization. When we break the division between traditional bank and finance, that was terrible. And as I mentioned in passing at the beginning, finance is extractive. It's just like mining. Once you've got the stuff that you need from the mine, you don't care about what happens to the mine. You're out of there. The traditional bank cared about the sons and daughters of their clients doing better than their clients, because that was business. Finance, once they have extracted what they need from that, which is quite different from the traditional bank, which is interest rate and whatever. So there is a whole set of rather complex and quite diverse logics that come in play that are extraordinarily problematic. And my best book, which took me 9 years, I was at the University of Chicago. I became a monk, not a nun, monk, very different, very honorable. There I deal with all of this. So you're absolutely right in saying I did not bring it up here, because when I start talking about it, I need about 8 hours. You know what I mean? To really lay it out. I mean, I really went digging.
Can we, I'd like the next question to be from a student, please.
Oh, yes. Okay, I have 3. Why don't you ask all 3? Not at the same time, but just ask. You start.
Thank you very much. So I have 2 small questions. One is that
I like small questions. Yes.
One is about disempowerment. So you mentioned a lot.
Disempowerment.
Yeah, disempowerment, or the paradox between the disempowerment and the enabling. Because, for example, Uber, When I first came to Philadelphia, I was a little bit surprised to learn that most of the Uber drivers, they're either out of job because of the 2008 financial crisis, or they're the new immigrants into the city. So when they couldn't find a job, they chose Uber, and that actually helped them make a living in a transitional period. So I'm curious, although this new digitalization might be disempowering to the poor neighborhood, but it can also help people, not just in Philadelphia, but in many large cities. How do you look at this paradox between...
No, it's not a paradox in this case. You know, it's rather simple that if there is a source of income that works, and a little digital app, which is brilliant, but it is a little app, basically, can help, well, that's great. And that is what I'm also talking about when I'm saying, what about those little, very modest applications, that can make all the difference in a low-income neighborhood, right? This is, when I say Uber, what were you criticizing? What did you say that was negative but is a positive? Is it Uber or?
Yes.
Well, I mean, Uber exploits its workers also. Yes, they can make a living, but you know, we have a lot of evidence. But you know, I'm not saying that Uber is necessarily bad. It really does depend a bit. But I don't want to do is romanticize it, you know? And maybe now they're trying to straighten themselves out. I mean, I find it's a brilliant little innovation. Instead of you going, find the car finds you. I mean, why didn't somebody think about it sooner, right? And et cetera, et cetera. So I understand where you're coming from, and I sort of agree that it makes a living. The guy became so rich, and he super exploited the drivers. That is the other part of the story that I don't quite like. You know, so yes, they made a bit of living, but they also, you know, they could have had a bit more. Because, you know, with time they discovered that they had to keep the car in certain conditions. They had to pay for everything. And it was a curve. For many of these drivers that were there from the start, you know, they discovered at some point, now come the costs. So it was a bit of exploitation, a bit too much of exploitation, you know. If they could have had a bigger share and not so many costs, it would have been perfect. I don't know if perfect, but, you know, good. But I'm sorry, I was going to take three at the same time, right?
Hi, I have a question about this concept of the hacking of the city. Because
the what?
Hacking of the city.
Oh, hacking, yes.
Because
hacking off and the city hacking.
Yes.
Yeah.
The discussion about Airbnb made me think about it, that I think it's a situation that we can generalize to many countries where the native language is not English, that Airbnb was used as a survival tactic by especially middle class youth who have the language and also who are familiar with technological tools. So it was a survival tactic for living, to continue to live in the urban center.
Yeah.
But now we are seeing that it's privatized. And with the examples that you have given also about this application for poorer classes, or in your journal article there was some kind of categories for homeless and children who can make new knowledge about the city. But we cannot be sure that this knowledge can be extracted for private purposes, and these all tools like Airbnb or other kind of things can also transform. So
absolutely, but that is where my concern was when I talked about these applications that we're working on, is how do we strengthen the low-income neighborhood, the low-wage worker? How do we connect workplace and home place, home zone, you know, the neighborhood, for low-wage workers? We do it for the middle classes. We do it, you know, we are, and so that my interest, you know, in when I was talking about these apps, etc., is really strengthening those the possibilities of these low-income neighborhoods, because they are so deprived of things, and there's some very simple elements that can make a difference. What I didn't mention, just to give you an example, I mentioned one example, right? But here's another example. So a little app, these are all real, they all exist now. A little app that allows the parent, we're talking very low-income neighborhoods that are a bit stressed, to communicate directly with the teacher, or rather the teacher directly with the parent and say, your kid is not in school. If, in the absence of that option, it has to go through the administration, the child will be in trouble. This is a very direct, informal act of communication that prevents a whole lot of negatives. Do you follow what I'm saying? So there are many little things. I mean, we are completely spoiled. We have all of what we need. You know, we have this and that and that. And I'm just amazed at how the most simple needs that these low income neighborhoods could really have, you know, be filled, so to speak, and that isn't happening. Now, it also has complex, the legal issues are different, as I mentioned, you know, in that article. When it comes to the legal issues there, you need an expert. That's very different from these very simple little thingies. But, so, yeah, are we there?
Thank you very much for your talk. So my question was regarding the future, because you've shown the chart where you said that $217 trillion, so the global real estate assets are like what?
Financialized assets.
Right, are like 217 trillion US dollars. So I was wondering how that might play out in the future, because I've got like two dystopias in my head. The one is where the city is so gentrified that there are not anymore the poor living amongst the rich, or the other way around. And the second dystopia being like the next financial crisis where it all blows up, and so I don't know how that can be brought together.
Yeah, well, I mean, both are possibilities, right? That you mentioned, we have seen it, we have lived through some of these crises. At the same time, I mean, these big cities, they have vast stretches of their, you know, of their space, which are totally unconnected to these worlds, you see? So there, I think that sooner or later we will have a crisis. I think we're already at a point where things are a bit dodgy. So we will have a crisis. But, you know, they can handle it. So they'll lose a few buildings, some will go broke, but so what? I mean, who cares, really? By the way, since we are at it, how many of you knew that, remember when the 2008 crisis hits, which was serious stuff, and we had a debate in Congress, a very good debate about TAR, you know, giving $700 billion, half of it was going to go to these firms, you know, that were in trouble, etc. And it was voted yes. At the same time, secretly, our Fed under Bernanke opted for transferring $7 trillion to the global banking system, i.e. the elite banks. Bloomberg News is aware that this is happening, but has to formally file an application, you know, for getting the information, etc., for freedom of information. It takes 2.5 years. That is our central bank, not some nasty corporation. The central bank is ours, you know what I mean. And the data finally come out 2.5 years later. The Financial Times, in other words, by then the debate had, you know, calmed down. The Financial Times has a front page. The Financial Times for me is one of the best newspapers, by the way, because it goes way beyond sort of narrow finance and all of that. So front page with all the details, the enormous list of claimants on that money. This was to rescue the global system a bit. I mean, the global being a very Western elite set. And, I mean, it had extraordinary information. And, you know, by then the crisis was sort of, had been, almost nobody saw that, which to me is always very interesting, what we don't see. If it's not sort of in our, you know, do you follow? I spoke a bit in shorthand there. But anyhow, it showed that a lot of money, so it was $7 trillion transferred basically to the global banking system in the form of 21,000 plus requests at the images, the little, how do you call it? You know, when you go to a post office and there is a little window through which a little window, This stuff is amazing, a full page. This is Bloomberg News who got that out. I mean, some of us knew that this was happening, but you didn't have the evidence. And then it sort of the crisis had sort of passed. And to me, it indicates that a lot of people don't get the logics that are here at work. Because if you get the logic, you're on guard for that kind of stuff, right? And we give them another 7 trillion, you understand, via quantitative easing. You know? Yes, our government is poorer now. It has debt, you know, so do others. Anyhow, these are to me, very problematic developments. Okay, are we done?
Yes.
Right.
Please join me.
Lovely.
Thanking Saskia.